Imagine standing at the edge of the world, snow swirling around your boots, the sky thin and silent above you, and no sound but your own heartbeat echoing against the cliffs. You're in the Himalayas now, but you're not alone. Beneath your feet lies a frozen archive, not of books, not of ruins, but of DNA, locked in the bodies of the people who call this land home. And what that DNA reveals rewrites everything we thought we knew about how humans settled, adapted, and evolved in this part of the world. Nepal is more than a country. It's a natural fortress. To its south, the humid lowlands of India. To its north, the desolate cold of the Tibetan Plateau. And in between, the jagged spine of earth, carved by time and pressure, stretching above the clouds. This isn't geography. This is destiny. Because it was these very mountains that sculpted something far more complex than rivers and valleys. They sculpted human identity. You see, while civilizations rose and fell on either side, Mauryans, Mughals, Chinese dynasties, Nepal remained eerily still. Not politically, not culturally, but genetically. Because the Himalayas did something no empire ever could. They protected memory. They turned migration into imprisonment and isolation into incubation. They allowed bloodlines to live untouched for generations, evolving quietly, secretly, at their own pace. Modern scientists have a name for this: genetic bottlenecking. But in Nepal, it's more than just a scientific term. It's the story of villages that sit just 10 miles apart, yet carry DNA so distinct they could belong to separate nations. In Europe, those kinds of differences might span countries. In Nepal, they span cliffs. And here's the paradox. Nepal didn't shut the world out completely. It was a crossroads, a whispering path between India and Tibet, between East and South Asia. Traders passed. Ideas passed. But populations? They stayed. Because here, altitude was king. Altitude determined not just where you lived, but whether your DNA could survive. From the Terai Plains to the icy windswept ridges, every microclimate bred a different kind of human endurance. Some learned to farm at 2,000 meters. Others learned to breathe at 4,000. And as those adaptations took root, so did isolation. The result? A kaleidoscope of genetic signatures. Not blurred together, but sharpened apart. This is why Nepal's DNA doesn't resemble India's, or China's, or even Tibet's entirely. It is its own thing. Its own fingerprint. And this fingerprint was shaped by the land itself, sculpted by wind, stone, silence, and time. Today, when geneticists run sequencing on Nepalese groups, from the Sherpas of Solukhumbu to the Magars of the Kali-Gandaki Valley, what they find is shocking. Not just diversity, but preserved distinction. Different markers, different haplogroups, different histories coded into every molecule. And more incredibly, these distinctions exist not in spite of proximity, but because of the mountains. Because when every village is a fortress, every family becomes a genetic vault. And it's not just isolation, it's survival. Imagine being born in a village where oxygen levels are 60% lower than the plains, where the cold can kill in minutes, where the land offers no mercy. Now imagine your ancestors living there for thousands of years, and not just surviving, but thriving. The DNA had to change. And it did. It adapted. It held tight to the mutations that worked, and discarded those that didn't. Over generations, the mountains sculpted the genome of an entire people. Not through war, not through conquest, but through breath, through blood, through the brutal selection of nature's oldest test. Can you live where others die? This is why Nepalese DNA is so unique. Because it was written by mountains. And mountains don't lie. Long before maps were drawn, before borders divided the earth, there were footsteps, silent, bare, relentless, moving across the spine of Asia. These were not armies. These were not kings. They were families, tribes, wandering in search of survival. And some of them climbed where no one had gone before. Nepal's genetic tale begins not with one migration, but two. Two journeys, separated by elevation, time, and ancestry, but both colliding in this rugged land to create a legacy no other nation carries. The first came from the roof of the world. Thousands of years ago, a wave of people moved southward from the high plateaus of Tibet, bringing with them not just tools and language, but something far more enduring: their genes. These were the early Tibeto-Burman groups, the ancestors of today's Sherpas, Tamongs, Magars, and Rice. Their blood carried whispers of East Eurasia, their lungs adapted to an oxygen-starved sky, and their bones remembered the cold. They followed the rivers downward, carving out lives in the valleys of Nepal's middle hills. But even as they descended, they didn't forget where they came from. Their DNA still echoes that altitude, a quiet marker of their origin, imprinted deep in the body. But there was another story unfolding, one that moved through shadows, through forests, through lowland trails that bypassed the icy barricades. This was the second migration, and it came not from above, but from below. From northeast India and northern Myanmar, another wave flowed quietly into the southern flanks of the Himalayas. Unlike the Tibetan highlanders, these migrants traveled at lower altitudes, skirting the snows, moving through humid jungles and narrow passes. And unlike their high-altitude cousins, their ancestry held a different signature, not derived from the Tibetan gene pool, but something older, something forgotten. The people of this migration, linked today to tribes like the Nagas, carried genetic markers that would later surface in Nepalese populations like the Newars and some low-altitude Magars. This wasn't an invasion. It wasn't even a collision. It was a blending, slow, silent, and almost invisible, until the day we learned to read genomes. Now, when scientists examine the DNA of southern Himalayan groups, they find something unexpected. Not just East Asian ancestry, but East Asian ancestry that doesn't come from Tibet. Instead, it comes from those lowland migrants who cross sideways into Nepal rather than over the top. This is the hidden lineage, the second pulse in Nepal's genetic heartbeat. It shattered assumptions. For decades, researchers believed all East Asian genetic influence in Nepal must have come from the Tibetan plateau. But then came the genome-wide studies, sequencing over 700,000 SNPs, and the data told a different story. Southern Himalayan Tibeto-Burman groups weren't simply descended from Sherpa-like ancestors. They had been touched by another current, one that flowed under the radar. This dual migration rewrote what we thought we knew. The Sherpas and Tamongs carry the high-altitude legacy, molded by snow and wind. But the Newars and others carry a more terrestrial memory of forests, riverbanks, and low passes. Together, they form a double helix of history, spiraling in one place and one place only. And this convergence, it didn't happen in India. It didn't happen in Tibet. It happened here, in the vertical heart of Nepal. The result is a population that doesn't fit into neat boxes. It can't be labeled simply South Asian or East Asian. It's both and more. Because while these migrations may have started far apart, they ended in the same sacred geography, reshaped by the same hills, speaking to the same sky. And over thousands of years, what was once separate became layered, not merged, but braided, like the rivers that crashed down from Himalayan glaciers, merging streams of ancestry, each with its own temperature, its own sediment, its own origin. This is why Nepalese DNA is a paradox. It contains the memory of altitude and the breath of the forest. It remembers both the blinding cold and the jungle heat. It carries genes from travelers who came from opposite directions and settled in a place that belonged to neither. What we are uncovering now is not just migration history. It's a molecular myth, one where the Himalayas weren't just walls, but mirrors, where every arrival left behind more than footprints. They left behind legacy in the cells of their descendants. And those descendants, they're still here, living, breathing, walking the same paths, carrying two ancient stories in a single bloodstream. In the shadow of the world's tallest mountains, a silent biological miracle has been unfolding for thousands of years. It doesn't shout. It doesn't shine. It lives quietly, in the lungs, in the blood, and in the genes of people who were born to live where no one else can breathe. At 4,000 meters above sea level, the air is thin. Oxygen, the very essence of survival, is scarce. Most people who climb here feel their hearts race, their vision blur, their bodies collapse. But not the Sherpas, not the Highlanders of Nepal. For them, this is home, not a challenge, but a rhythm. And now, thanks to cutting-edge genetics, we're beginning to understand why. Inside the DNA of these mountain-born communities lies a rare adaptation, a kind of evolutionary masterstroke. It's not just endurance. It's design. The key. A gene called EPS1, sometimes nicknamed the superathlete gene. Though in Nepal, it's not about running faster. It's about surviving the impossible. This genetic variant doesn't increase red blood cell production the way it would in lowlanders struggling with altitude. That would actually thicken the blood dangerously. Instead, EPAS-1 allows Sherpas to deliver oxygen to their organs more efficiently, without triggering the side effects that would cripple others. It's a quiet efficiency, a silent mastery of elevation, and it's not found everywhere. In fact, it's shockingly rare across global populations. You don't see it in South Asia. You don't find it widely in East Asia. Even among Tibetans, where the variant likely originated, the expression differs. But among Nepal's Sherpa communities, it's almost ubiquitous. That's no accident. This gene didn't appear overnight. It was carved, generation by generation, by the cruel arithmetic of survival. Those who had it lived. Those who didn't fade it from the gene pool. And this isn't just a story of one gene. Genome-wide studies show that high-altitude Nepalese populations have entire clusters of unique mutations related to oxygen sensing, hemoglobin regulation, and cardiovascular performance. These aren't enhancements. They're necessities. Because at these altitudes, biology becomes negotiation. Every breath is a test. In a recent genetic survey of highland communities like Naga village, perched at a staggering 4,180 meters, researchers discovered a remarkable pattern. These people weren't just surviving. They were isolated. Their genomes showed almost no recent admixture, no mixing with lowland populations, no outside gene flow diluting their specialized biology. This is rare in human genetics. We are a species that mixes constantly. Yet here, in the thin blue roof of the world, we find a population that has stood apart, untouched, undisturbed, and quietly evolving toward a very specific goal, to master thin air. And perhaps what's most astonishing is that these adaptations aren't just physical. They reflect culture, too. The Sherpas' way of life, their diets, rituals, seasonal movement patterns, all reinforce and preserve these traits. It's not just DNA that survives here. It's a whole philosophy of endurance. When scientists speak of natural selection, they often point to the dramatic, diseases, disasters, predators. But in Nepal's highlands, nature's challenge was simpler and more relentless. It asked, can you carry your child up the slope? Can you plant your crop before the frost returns? Can you breathe just enough and not too much? The answer, embedded in every Sherpa cell, is yes. And that yes echoes far beyond Nepal. Because what we're learning from these genes isn't just about adaptation. It's about what's possible. It's about how environment can sculpt humanity, not over millions of years, but in a few dozen generations. It's about how quiet isolation can produce loud answers to nature's toughest questions. In a world obsessed with technological enhancement, the people of Nepal remind us, some superpowers are earned the hard way, through endurance, loss, and time. So the next time someone asks why Nepalese DNA is so unique, tell them it learned to breathe where most of us would fall. From a distance, Nepal appears unified, a single silhouette against the sky. Temples perched on ridges, prayer flags dancing with the wind. But step closer, and you'll see something else entirely. Not uniformity, not sameness, but complexity. Dozens of cultures folded into one land, and inside each culture a code, distinct and untouched. Nepal isn't one people. It's over 125 ethnic identities, each carrying their own languages, traditions, beliefs, and most surprisingly, their own genetic blueprints. In most countries, proximity dissolves difference. But here, even neighboring villages can be genetically non-overlapping islands. Take the Magars and Gurungs of the Kali-Gandaki Valley. They share the same landscape. They grow the same crops. They pray to similar gods. Yet, in their DNA, they are as different as strangers. Studies show sharply contrasting markers in basic genetic traits, like ABO blood groups. Despite centuries of coexistence, the land brought them near. But the mountain kept their bloodlines apart. Why? Because in Nepal, terrain is not just physical, it's cultural. Every valley, every ridge, Every trail acts as a divider, not just of ecosystems, but of entire ancestries. Isolation here doesn't break people. It shapes them. In Solukhumbu, the Sherpas live just a few days' walk from Rai and Limbu communities, but they may as well be generations apart. Their genetics reflect separate evolutionary paths, with minimal intermarriage or gene flow. Where elsewhere in the world time erodes distinction, Nepal's geography preserves it, like ancient parchment sealed from the rain. What's even more extraordinary is how these differences persist despite shared environments. In some districts, multiple ethnic groups live within shouting distance of each other, and yet their mitochondrial DNA, the maternal line, tells entirely separate origin stories. Some trace back to prehistoric settlers of the Himalayas. Others hint at ancient migrants who entered Nepal through unexpected corridors, blending not with neighbors, but with memory. Scientific analyses using over 700,000 SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, have uncovered profound substructure in the genome of Nepalese populations. We're not talking about surface-level variation. We're talking about deep genetic scaffolding, where even core metabolic traits, enzyme responses, and disease resistance markers differ tribe to tribe. In other words, Nepal isn't a melting pot. It's a genetic museum, with every ethnic group its own living exhibit. And within this museum, certain features reappear like ancestral signatures. The EDR gene polymorphism, for example, shows up in select Nepalese groups and not others, offering clues about historical diet, climate adaptation, even hair morphology. These aren't aesthetic quirks. They're the residue of evolution shaped by altitude, temperature, humidity, and time. One might expect, over centuries, that these groups would blur into one another. But genetic drift, the slow march of change in isolated populations, has done the opposite. It has pushed them further apart, genetically. The more remote the community, the more distinct its genome. It's not just the hills that separate them. It's worldview, its custom, its rhythm of life. Each group develops survival strategies honed for specific altitudes, seasons, crops, and diseases. Their genes followed suit. So when we ask, why is Nepalese DNA so unique? We must also ask, which Nepalese DNA? Because the real marvel isn't just that Nepal is different from the world. It's that Nepal is different from itself. It is a country made of contrasts, not layered like paint, but fractured like glass, with every shard catching light in a different way. That's the power of isolation. That's the miracle of survival in a vertical world. And that's why no other place on Earth tells a genetic story quite like this. There's a strange feeling you get when you zoom out far enough. When you pull away from the mountains, the rivers, the flags fluttering in thin air, and instead stare at data points on a screen. Thousands of genomes, lines, graphs, numbers. But somewhere inside that cold matrix, Nepal shines like a flare. In a comparative study involving nearly 1,000 Nepalese genomes against a massive global pool of over 38,000 individuals, something remarkable emerged. The Nepalese didn't cluster with India. They didn't nestle with Tibet. They didn't align neatly with Southeast Asia either. They stood apart, a distinct constellation, defying geographic logic. At first, this made no sense. How could a land surrounded by superpowers, hemmed in by ancient empires, retain such a separate genetic footprint? But then came the deeper dives, the statistical modeling, the neighbor-joining trees. And the answer was clear. Nepal wasn't isolated by accident. It was engineered by terrain and time to evolve alone. Among the most fascinating revelations came from populations like the Newar and Magar. These groups carry a genetic structure that doesn't align with any contemporary highland or lowland population. Instead, they echo something far older, something prehistoric. Traces that resemble Himalayan settlers long extinct elsewhere, preserved only in the genetic core of Nepal. This isn't just about ancestry. It's about genetic substructure, the invisible architecture that defines how a population evolves. Not what's on the surface, but what lies beneath. Regulatory regions, mutation densities, haplotype divergence. It's the DNA equivalent of tectonic plates. And in Nepal, those plates tell a story of parallel evolution. Take the principal component analysis from recent studies. It doesn't just scatter populations by geography, it maps them by history. And here, the Nepalese show internal fracturing, a kind of genetic quilt made from dozens of threads, South Asian influences, East Asian fragments, Central Asian whispers, and something else, something purely Himalayan. This mosaic is no accident. It reflects thousands of years of migration waves that didn't conquer, but layered themselves over existing groups. And rather than blending into one uniform gene pool, these layers crystallized into discrete subpopulations. That's the opposite of what we see in most of the world, where mixing creates blur. In Nepal, time created clarity. One stunning example: the Magars and Tamangs, two of Nepal's major ethnic groups, often live near one another, marry within their own communities, and share spiritual practices. But under the microscope, their Y chromosome haplogroups diverge completely. They are paternal opposites, shaped by different migration events, different ancestors, different pasts. And then there's the EDR gene, often associated with East Asian populations, influencing traits like hair thickness, dental structure, and sweat glands. In Nepal, this gene appears in select groups only, not widely, not uniformly, but surgically targeted across the ethnic map. It's like finding echoes of forgotten ancestry ringing inside only a few chambers of a vast genetic cathedral. When you piece this together, the picture that forms is both chaotic and beautiful. Nepal isn't a land of faded identities. It's a land of preserved fractures, and those fractures are sacred. Because in a world rushing toward genetic homogeneity, Nepal stands as a rare sanctuary of divergent evolution. This is why when we speak of Nepalese DNA, we're really speaking in plural. It's not one story, it's many. Stories that never merged, never erased one another, never got lost in the flood of empire. Instead, they remained intact, raw, pure, alive. And what's most poetic? That such deep, ancient complexity doesn't shout from the mountaintops. It whispers from bloodlines, from villages tucked behind cloud walls, from families who still speak the tongue of their ancestors, live by their calendars, and carry their biology. Nepal's genetic substructure is not a puzzle waiting to be solved. It is a memory waiting to be heard. Sometimes, to understand what makes something rare, you have to step far enough away to see how it compares to everything else. Not just in its neighborhood, not just on its continent, but across the planet. And when scientists did exactly that with Nepalese DNA, what they saw left them stunned. It was like watching a satellite photo of Earth and realizing one mountain was glowing differently. Using massive genome databases, tens of thousands of human DNA sequences from across Asia, Europe, and beyond, geneticists began placing Nepalese samples into the global puzzle. But instead of blending in with their neighbors, these genomes did something unexpected. They formed their own cluster, not next to India, not beside Tibet, not absorbed into East Asia, but alone, separate, singular, a pocket of ancestry untouched by the tidal forces that shaped much of the region. How could this be? Surrounded by ancient powers, seated at a historical crossroad, and yet genetically off the map? The answer lies in something deeper than geography. It lies in how Nepal absorbed, and then preserved, the echoes of ancient migrations while the rest of the world kept shifting. Most regions underwent wave after wave of conquest, trade, assimilation. Bloodlines got rewritten, histories erased. But Nepal held the line. And perhaps no community illustrates this better than the Newar. Located at the cultural heart of Nepal in the Kathmandu Valley, they were merchants, architects, artists, but they were also genetic gatekeepers. Their genome reflects layers of ancestry that resemble no single neighboring population, but a composite of lineages that no longer exist outside their borders. Even more astonishing is how Nepal's lowland and highland populations position themselves genetically. The high-altitude groups, like the Sherpas, show patterns closest to Tibetan ancestry, but still diverge in key high-altitude adaptations. The lowland groups, like some Magars and Tharas, show ancient traces that may predate many South Asian lineages altogether. It's like Nepal carries the memory of civilizations we've forgotten, preserved not in monuments or manuscripts, but in genes that refuse to move. In scientific visualizations, like principal component graphs or genetic distance maps, Nepalese samples repeatedly resist simplification. They refuse to conform. They linger on the edges of clusters or form islands of their own, tiny anomalies in a world desperate for patterns. But Nepal doesn't fit the pattern. Nepal is the exception. What makes this even more powerful is that this uniqueness isn't the result of isolation alone. It's the product of controlled intermixing. Nepal didn't wall itself off. It chose which migrations to absorb, which to resist, and which to let settle like sediment in its valleys. That delicate filtering, happening over thousands of years, has created a genome that functions like a palimpsest, an ancient manuscript that's been written over but never erased. Scratch beneath the surface of Nepalese DNA, and you won't find one story. You'll find many, superimposed, layered, intact. Some researchers believe this complexity could help unlock broader mysteries about human expansion in Asia, including how and when different branches of modern humans moved eastward, where they paused, and where they survived. Nepal, in this context, isn't just a participant in history. It's a living archive. It records the moment when two great rivers of humanity, South Asia and East Asia, met not with a clash, but with a quiet interweaving. And while the world moved on, Nepal held the pattern, a still point in a turning genetic world. So when you ask where Nepal fits in the global genetic map, the real answer is, it doesn't. It draws its own outline. It follows no blueprint. It stands alone, and in that solitude, it carries the legacy of forgotten migrations, frozen crossroads, and a resilience that echoes far beyond its peaks. There are stories buried so deep in our DNA that no book records them, no monument honors them, and no map dares mark their path. But they exist in shadows and silences, in fragments passed down quietly through blood. And in Nepal, one such fragment leads us to an unexpected place far from the snowcaps, deep into the forests of the eastern frontier. For decades, geneticists believed that East Asian ancestry in Nepal must have flowed from Tibet, carried down by high-altitude migrants into the Middle Hills. The logic made sense. The proximity, the language, the altitude. But then the data began to whisper a different truth, one that pointed not upward, but sideways. The real revelation came when scientists traced certain genetic markers in southern Himalayan Tibeto-Burman groups, populations living far below the ridgelines, in more temperate zones of eastern Nepal. Here, something didn't fit. These groups did carry East Asian ancestry, but not the kind you'd expect from Tibetan lineages. It was older, subtler, and it matched more closely with populations from an entirely different region, northeast India and northern Myanmar. This is where the trail leads to the Nagas, a diverse tribal confederation known for their oral traditions, warrior societies, and geographic seclusion in the hills straddling India and Burma. Though politically distant from Nepal, the Nagas may have left a genetic fingerprint on the lower flanks of the Himalayas, a whisper of migration that flowed beneath the snow line, bypassing the cold altitudes altogether. The theory? While one wave of ancestors descended from Tibet, another moved laterally, across forested corridors and river valleys, merging with early Nepalese communities in the south and east. These weren't mass movements. They were slow drips, generations migrating across bamboo-covered slopes, settling, mixing, adapting, and eventually disappearing into the background of culture. But not from the genome. Today, when scientists scan the low-altitude Tibeto-Burman groups, especially those in regions like eastern Nepal, near the Arun River Basin, they find evidence that supports this dual origin, a blend of high-altitude markers and lowland East Asian signatures. It's not just admixture. It's a layered legacy, one that challenges everything we thought we knew about population flow in the Himalayas. This matters because it rewrites the narrative. Nepal wasn't just a recipient of northern migrations. It was a crossroads for eastward and lateral currents, a meeting point for mountain and jungle, for cold plateau and monsoon valley. What makes the Naga link even more compelling is how it connects Nepal to a broader network of prehistoric movement, one that includes groups in Nagaland, Assam, Manipur, and stretches all the way into western Myanmar. The DNA doesn't lie. Certain haplogroups and mitochondrial markers, particularly in women from eastern Nepalese tribes, reflect ancestral connections far outside the borders of Nepal. And yet, they're not present in Tibet or Mongolia. meaning this influence came from below, not above. This discovery reframes our entire view of how Nepal's ethnic complexity emerged. It wasn't just shaped by altitude, but by direction, by the subtle angle of migration, by forgotten routes along ancient trade paths and ecological transitions. Where the ice sees vertical barriers, the genome sees invisible corridors. And so, a new dimension is added to Nepal's genetic identity. Not just mountain-born, but jungle-born. Not just shaped by the winds of the north, but by the humidity of the east. The Naga influence reminds us of something powerful. That genetic history is never linear. It's not a straight river. It's a delta of movement, a labyrinth of origins, where even the smallest tributary can leave an imprint for millennia. And in Nepal, that imprint remains, not as legend, not as architecture, but as code, humming quietly in the veins of those who carry the memory of a migration no one wrote down, but everyone inherited. Most scientific breakthroughs begin in sterile labs, under fluorescent lights, surrounded by wires and machines. But some of the world's most ambitious genetic research started somewhere else entirely, at the edge of breath, in the stillness of frostbitten silence, thousands of meters above sea level. To understand Nepal's DNA, scientists didn't just download data, they ascended, physically, logistically, logically, into the cold arms of a landscape that defies preservation, defies access, and defies predictability. Why? Because the answers weren't waiting in books. They were waiting in villages clinging to cliffs, in communities untouched by time, in bloodlines sealed by altitude. In the Gauri Shankar Conservation Area, teams of anthropologists and geneticists collected samples from families living as high as 4,180 meters, in places like Naga village, where oxygen is scarce and winters don't forgive. This wasn't a textbook expedition. This was survival-level fieldwork, in one of the harshest environments any genetic team has ever worked in. The technical barrier? DNA degradation. Heat, humidity, and altitude are the enemies of ancient genetic material. In most tropical and high-altitude regions, DNA doesn't last. It breaks down. It disappears. But somehow, miraculously, the samples from Nepal held strong enough to reveal what had never been seen before. Using advanced genotyping tools, like the Humanami Express version 1.1 chip, researchers were able to scan over 720,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs. Essentially, the individual switches that control how human biology behaves. Add to that mitochondrial sequencing and 23 locus YSTR analysis, and what they found was staggering. This wasn't just about identity. It was about adaptation. Genes related to oxygen transport, thermal regulation, altitude resilience. They weren't just present. They were custom-built by nature for this terrain. It was as if the Himalayas had carved their own signature into human biology. But it wasn't just the data that stood out. It was the integrity of the method. Every participant gave informed consent. Every sample was ethically handled. Every sequence was verified under strict protocols, funded and reviewed by institutions like the European Research Council and the National Institutes of Health. Even the ethics clearance, granted by the University of Bologna, became part of a meticulous blueprint that set a new global standard for high-altitude genetic research. And through it all, the challenge wasn't just scientific, it was human. Transporting equipment across rugged terrain, preserving samples in freezing temperatures, building trust with remote communities, convincing elders to share bloodlines that had never been measured, never been mapped. This wasn't field work. This was a genetic pilgrimage, because what was at stake wasn't just Nepal's story. It was humanity's capacity to adapt, to evolve under pressure, to carve survival into the very molecules of life. The researchers weren't chasing data points. They were listening to the language of DNA spoken at its highest octave, and what they brought back from those heights wasn't just charts or sequences. They brought back perspective, proof that the genome isn't static. It's sculpted by place. And in Nepal, that place is unlike anywhere else on Earth. So the next time someone says science happens in cities, in labs, in lecture halls, tell them about the scientists who scaled the Himalayas, not for glory, not for conquest, but to listen, to decode, to preserve a message written into blood by wind, snow, and time. They live closer to the sky than any other people on Earth. And yet, in the language of science, their voices have barely been heard. The Sherpas, guardians of altitude, descendants of breath, are one of the most remarkable genetic populations on the planet. But they've never asked for recognition, because surviving where others cannot has always been enough. In the realm of global genetics, some communities are overstudied. The Sherpas, for centuries, were understood only by myth, labeled strong, resilient, born for the mountains. But none of that captured the truth. Their strength isn't legend, it's lineage. Modern studies have finally begun to crack open their genome, and what lies inside is not just adaptation, it's isolation. Unlike their lowland neighbors, Sherpas show stunning genetic purity across multiple studies. Minimal recent admixture, minimal drift. Their DNA holds a consistency that suggests centuries of continuity, lived far from the mixing pools of trade, empire, or colonization. This isn't just about endurance. It's about biological legacy, a kind of genetic time capsule preserved by terrain and tradition. Their uniqueness is visible down to the smallest molecular shifts. Genes related to oxygen efficiency, mitochondrial function, and muscle regulation are configured unlike any other human group. They don't just handle thin air better, they require it. Low altitudes feel unnatural to many Sherpas. Their systems are designed for the sky. But even more fascinating is what their DNA tells us about human thresholds. How far can biology push before it breaks? In Sherpas, we see that line redrawn. Their bodies carry lower hemoglobin counts than those seen in typical high-altitude dwellers, a paradox that stuns scientists. Fewer red blood cells should mean less oxygen, but for Sherpas, it means optimized flow, reduced viscosity, and enhanced efficiency. Their blood isn't overworking. It's outsmarting. Yet while science begins to catch up, culturally, the Sherpas remain distant from the spotlight. Their knowledge, passed through oral traditions, rituals, and seasonal patterns, contains insights no lab has ever replicated. How to read wind from cloud shapes. How to sense avalanche threats by snow texture. How to measure storm pressure from joint pain. These aren't folk tales. These are unwritten algorithms, coded by generations of exposure and silence. And here lies the paradox. Sherpas are genetically exceptional, yet institutionally invisible. Until recently, they were rarely included in major genomic databases. Their role in global discoveries, from altitude adaptation to muscle recovery studies, often referenced, but rarely centered. Why? Because the world measures worth by visibility, and the Sherpas have never needed to be seen. They've always belonged to the unseen. But if we're to understand the full range of human evolution, we cannot overlook them. We cannot keep collecting their biological data without honoring their narrative. The very landscape that isolated them also preserved their genome in its most potent form. And within that preservation lies a gift, not just for Nepal, but for humanity. It tells us that isolation isn't always regression. Sometimes it's refinement. That evolution doesn't just rush forward. Sometimes it climbs. The Sherpa genome isn't a mystery anymore. It's a message. One that says survival isn't about dominating nature, but synchronizing with it. Quietly, precisely, without demand. And maybe that's the truest form of strength.